In the vast expanse of the American frontier, where the desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, there rode a man named Jacob. He was a cowboy, hardened by years of solitude and survival. His face bore the scars of countless storms, and his eyes held the weight of a life lived without roots or attachments. One scorching afternoon, as Jacob guided his horse through a narrow canyon, he heard a sound that stopped him cold. It was a soft whimper, barely audible above the whisper of the wind. He dismounted and followed the sound, his hand instinctively resting on the revolver at his hip. There, lying beneath the sparse shade of a twisted mesquite tree, was a young woman. Her clothes were torn, and blood seeped from wounds on her side and shoulder. Her skin was bronzed by the sun, and her long dark hair was matted with dust and sweat. She was Apache, and from the looks of it, she had been running for her life. Jacob knelt beside her, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he examined her injuries. She opened her eyes, dark and filled with pain, and stared at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. He knew he should ride on. Getting involved with Apache troubles could mean his own death, but something in her eyes held him there. He lifted her carefully onto his horse and began the long ride to his small cabin, hidden deep in the mountains. For days, Jacob tended to her wounds. He brought her water, made broths from dried meat, and changed her bandages with the skill of someone who had patched himself up more times than he could count. Slowly, she began to heal. She told him her name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her language. As the weeks passed, something unexpected bloomed between them. Ayana began to smile, and Jacob found himself looking forward to the moments they shared. She taught him words in her language, and he showed her how to read the stars the way he did. In the quiet evenings, they sat by the fire, and the loneliness that had been Jacob's constant companion began to fade. But the world beyond their mountain refuge had not forgotten them. Ayana had fled from a brutal raid where her village was destroyed. The men responsible were still hunting for survivors. And worse, the cavalry was scouring the territory, treating any Apache as an enemy. One morning, Jacob woke to find Ayana standing at the cabin door, staring out at the horizon. Her expression was troubled. She turned to him, and he saw tears in her eyes for the first time. She spoke softly, her English halting but clear. She told him that staying with him put his life in danger. Her people would never accept their union, and his people would see him as a traitor. The love they had found was a beautiful impossibility, a flower growing in barren soil. Jacob stepped closer and took her hands. He told her he didn't care about any of that. He had spent his whole life drifting, belonging nowhere. But here, with her, he had found something worth fighting for. That night, they made plans. They would head north, to a territory where names and pasts could be left behind. They would build a new life together, far from the hatred and violence that had marked their old ones. But fate had other plans. 2 days before they were set to leave, riders appeared on the ridge above the cabin. Jacob recognized them immediately. Bounty hunters and soldiers, tracking Apache refugees. They had found Ayana's trail, and it led straight to his door. Jacob grabbed his rifle and positioned himself at the window. He told Ayana to hide in the cellar, but she refused. She stood beside him, armed with a knife, her eyes fierce and determined. The riders called out, demanding he hand over the Apache woman. Jacob's response was a warning shot that kicked up dust at their horses' feet. The message was clear. The standoff lasted hours. Jacob knew he couldn't hold them off forever. There were too many, and his ammunition was limited. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, he made a decision. He turned to Ayana and told her there was a narrow trail behind the cabin that led down the mountain. If she left now, under the cover of approaching darkness, she could escape. He would hold the riders here, give her the time she needed. Ayana's face crumpled. She shook her head violently, refusing to leave him. But Jacob was firm. He cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her, pouring everything he felt into that one moment. Then he told her that her life was worth more than his lonely existence. She had family still out there, a people who needed her. His love for her meant setting her free. With tears streaming down her face, Ayana finally agreed. She slipped out the back as the first shots rang out. Jacob fought with everything he had, drawing the rider's attention, making sure every eye was on him, and not on the fleeing shadow disappearing into the wilderness. When his ammunition ran out, Jacob stood in the doorway of his cabin, facing the approaching riders with empty hands, and a heart full of bittersweet peace. He had saved her. That was all that mattered. The riders took him, demanding to know where the Apache woman had gone. Jacob smiled and said nothing. They searched the cabin and the surrounding area, but found no trace of her. She was gone, like a spirit melting into the desert night. Jacob was taken away in chains, charged with harboring an enemy. But as he rode away from the only place he had ever called home, he looked back at the mountains and felt no regret. Somewhere out there, Ayana was alive and free. His heart had been broken, but it had also been filled. For the first time in his life, he had loved someone more than himself. And that love, though it cost him everything, had made him whole. Years later, stories would be told around frontier campfires about a cowboy who sacrificed everything for an Apache woman. Some said he died in prison. Others claimed he escaped and wandered the territories until his last days. But everyone agreed on one thing. His was a love that defied two worlds, a love that proved even in the harshest lands, the human heart could bloom with something beautiful and eternal.